My name is Heather Bryant. I'm the founder of Project Facet, which is an initiative to help newsrooms collaborate more efficiently and effectively. So collaborative journalism is when we see multiple newsrooms or newsrooms with non-newsroom partners working to do the kind of journalism they couldn't do if they're doing it by themselves, right? The stories are complicated and big and have far-reaching impacts, and newsrooms have fewer resources than they've ever had before. And a lot of organizations are realizing we can't do everything that we need to do if we're just doing it by ourselves. So they create partnerships with other newsrooms, with non-newsroom partners, in order to do the work that needs to be done despite all of these challenges. And it's become a really effective toolkit for a lot of organizations because it helps address challenges at multiple different levels, whether that's, we don't have the right people that we need in order to do this story. Maybe we don't have access to a specific community that would be impacted by this story that needs to be included, but this other organization does. It's the ability to focus the audience's attention on a story that really matters because you have multiple newsrooms saying this thing's important and we're all going to work on this together. So for newsrooms, collaboration has become this really effective strategy for addressing a lot of different challenges that we're facing inside of our organizations. It's been a big culture shift for organizations to think, what does this look like for me to be collaborative in the work that I'm doing, when the default design for a lot of newsrooms was we're either competing with every other organization that's out there, or we're just going to pretend they don't exist and we're the only newsroom who's trying to do this story. And collaboration instead insists, okay, you have to be open and you have to be willing to talk to people about what it is that you're working on, not holding things close to the vest as if no one can know about what we're doing because it's too important and they might scoop us. It's been this shift in realizing that competition isn't really between newsrooms anymore. It's between newsrooms and all of the people who would like to use the same platforms that we're using in order to influence the way people are thinking about a particular issue. I mean, our real competition now is lobbyists and politicians and governments and large businesses and special interest groups who are all invested in getting people to think a certain way or to believe a certain thing and don't have any of our industry's, allegiance to truth and fact-checking and the responsibility that we see in terms of making sure people are properly informed. That's the real competition now, is misinformation and disinformation. And so it's been this shift in newsrooms rethinking, okay, what does this look like to remove this notion of competition, to be open and to be willing to communicate and share what it is we're thinking about and what we're doing so that we can collaborate to make sure that this story happens, to make sure this audience is informed. So it's been this change in thinking, okay, what does this look like to approach the process of doing journalism? And that means bringing in people we wouldn't have normally, had in the process or allowed to participate in our editorial process, to open that up and to be interested in other viewpoints and how do we accomplish this? Who do we include in this? What does this look like to communicate and be very frank about what it is we're working on and what we're trying to accomplish? I think the motivation varies. I mean, newsrooms have always worked together to some degree. That's been a long-standing thing. Even, going back hundreds of years, people in newsrooms have always been, helpful or shared something. But it's been in the last few years that we've really seen this become like a capital C collaboration kind of thing, where there's more structure and more intention about this. And I think that is a reflection of the challenges are getting bigger, and there's so fewer of us than there used to be. I mean, we're tens and thousands of fewer journalists than there used to be. This work isn't getting easier, it's getting harder, and there are fewer of us to do it. And so some of the openness to collaboration has come about because there's work to be done and we have to do it, and that's more important than this notion of collaboration. And then part of it is there are people who would like to see us with fewer resources and weaker in our isolation from one another, and we have to rise to that challenge as well because that's what we owe to our audiences. And in a lot of ways it's sort of like that it's the intersection of journalism, the service-driven, constitutionally protected thing that we've recognized as a societal good, and then the industry of journalism that's long existed, that what does it look like to ensure we can do what we need to do despite all of the challenges that we're facing from a business model perspective or anything like that. And then we have a lot more newsrooms that are just from their very beginning are collaborative, and that's how they've been created. Those, a lot of the newer nonprofit newsrooms are sort of collaborative by default, and that's been a very interesting change to see. Nonprofit newsrooms are highly collaborative, but it's become a pretty substantial change across the industry. I mean, even just this week we saw a major project come out about the medical devices investigation through ICIJ, which was a global investigation. That's not a story one newsroom can do. And that's not going to be the last story that we see. That wouldn't be possible unless you had a lot of newsrooms working on it. I think number one, it comes down to communication. I think collaborations rise and fall on the strength of their ability to be open and communicative about what they're doing so that everybody is empowered to participate. You can't sort of leave anybody out of the loop and be successful in what you're doing. So that's the very first bar to hit, is the ability to make sure that you're communicating effectively and constantly with all of your partners and empowering everybody to participate. And there's also a huge trust component to collaboration. It's not a structure where one organization can kind of call all the shots and make sure, it's not a thing where you take control and everybody's there to do your bidding. It has to be an equitable arrangement where people are there because their contribution is respected and valued regardless of their size and their capacity, because every newsroom has something valuable to offer. And one of the hard things about collaboration is you're never going to find two newsrooms that are perfectly equal in staffing or capacity or resources or anything like that. So there's always this negotiation of, okay, well, what does it look like when we work together? What are the expectations going to be? How can we make sure that everybody knows what's expected of them, what the timelines are, what the deadlines are, so that everybody can effectively participate in the way that they're best suited for participation? And there's a lot of design that goes into collaborations to make sure that everybody knows what's going to happen. It's really hard if you don't think about how are we going to run this, what's the day-to-day look like, what are the goals that we're trying to get to. Then people start running into roadblocks during the project and they don't know how to resolve those types of things. So there's a huge amount of trust, a huge amount of clarity around what's your shared expectations and the shared sense of what we're doing here together. And when you can figure out those things, a lot of other problems sort of fix themselves or are addressed before they come up. So in the most recent one, like I mentioned earlier, the huge investigation that ICIJ just published this week around medical devices, and that started with a project in one newsroom around the approval process for different types of medical implants and things like that. And then they quickly realized that there were some global implications to that type of project. And so this became a story that needed more newsrooms involved in different spaces. And I believe it was a couple hundred different organizations across 36 different countries, or a couple hundred journalists across 30 different countries. And this is sort of in the same vein as previous projects that they've done, Paradise Papers and Panama Papers, where they've come across data or stories that are happening where it's very quickly realized this isn't just one place, this isn't just one country, this isn't just one city, and this isn't a story that one newsroom can do. And those have been some very fascinating projects to see from an international perspective. And then other projects that I've been particularly impressed with, there is one in Philadelphia called Broken Philly, which is tackling economic inequality, economic hardship. And this is, I think, 21 newsrooms all covering poverty in Philadelphia, but from a solutions journalism approach. So their stories are not necessarily poverty is a problem, here are some statistics about people who are experiencing hardship, here are some of the programs, and then they kind of move on. The stories are more from the perspective of, if you're experiencing this, here are resources for phones that you might be able to use, because everybody these days needs a cell phone. Or, the high cost of being broke was one of the series that they did about what is it like when you can't afford a bank account, or you can't afford your cell phone, or you can't afford diapers for your kids. The stories are reflective of the needs of the audience that they're hoping to serve. And by doing this through a variety of newsrooms, they're delivering it on different platforms. They're ensuring that the widest range of audiences can see this content. And so you're not just doing stories about a problem, you're also doing stories for the people experiencing that problem, which is something that is becoming a more obvious need in our industry, to serve not just information about an issue, but to serve people who are actually trying to navigate that issue. And then there is another project that it was also a solutions journalism one actually, the Montana Gap Project, which was a focus on stories in the Mountain West, which was sort of considered an undercovered, space for a lot of news organizations. We don't see a lot of stories about, Montana and Colorado and New Mexico, but there was this intentional focus about going there and saying, okay, what's not being covered here? And in what way could a collaboration help you do the kind of storytelling that you need to do to, help your audience understand what's going on, and to also understand, what's not being told about this place that people in a broader context would need to understand. I think that's one of the interesting values of collaboration out of that project. When I spoke to the editors, these are people working in fairly isolated newsrooms who don't get a lot of support. And a couple of them said, the great thing about this collaboration for me was I had another editor looking over my shoulder who was giving me feedback on my work, and I hadn't had that in a long time, and that was incredibly valuable for me. So there's also a value within newsrooms themselves where people who may not get some professional development or learn new skills or get some input on the work that they're doing, they're benefiting as journalists by being able to work with new journalists that they haven't, had access to before. I think one of the challenges that organizations run into when they think about what would it look like for us to collaborate is that they think there's only one way to do that, and it's, okay, our journalists and their journalists are going to work together and they're going to create a story together, or we'll each create a story and it'll be part of that series, and that's what collaboration looks like. But there are dozens of ways that newsrooms are collaborating, and every day we're seeing organizations figure out, okay, this is what collaboration will look like for us. And it might be that you put your reporters together and they write a story together, or it could be, we're going to host an event together, or we're going to host a series of events together, and we're going to pool our resources and our audiences to do that. The New Jersey Voting Block project that they did during the election, where they hosted potlucks on different neighborhood blocks throughout New Jersey in order to bring people together so they could talk about the elections and get to know their neighbors and understand their neighbors. That's not what a lot of people would think about when they would think about a collaboration, but that involved a number of national newsrooms and hyperlocal news organizations that were quite small coming together to say, what does it look like to facilitate these conversations? There was one in Texas recently where a bunch of newsrooms threw in money together so that they could buy a data set from the state. I think it was a voting data set, because none of them could have afforded that on their own. A couple of years ago, when the financial disclosures were being released for the White House and you had to request them by the name of the person the disclosure was for, they made that available on a Friday afternoon. I think there were more than 60 of them that would have had to been requested. And it was like 3 different newsrooms. I believe it was the AP, the Washington Post, and the ProPublica split the list into thirds, and each took a part of it and made those requests and then pooled all of the data. It takes so many different forms, and you can pick and choose what kind of collaboration best suits your comfort level with collaborating and what you're trying to achieve. The Center for Cooperative Media is currently building this database. I'm working with them to build a database of pretty much every journalistic collaboration that we can find, and there are nearly 200 in there, covering more than 1,500 newsrooms around the world. And, there's very few of them that look exactly like the other, but there's information about, were there people in charge? Did they have agreements? How were they funded? What was the goal of them? And the point behind that is collaboration can look like whatever you want it to look like. And so I think for newsrooms who are starting to think, okay, what would it look like for us? Remember, it can look like whatever you want it to look like, and it can, meet the goals that you set out for yourself, but you're not stuck into one structure. And I think that's really helpful for those who might be hesitant to think about collaboration, because they might be worried about being stuck in a process or a system that they might not want to engage with.